For 2 years, the Pacific sky delivered a single verdict. America could not hit back. Not because the fleet was weak, nor because its gunners lacked courage, but because every shell they fired vanished into empty air. 1,000 explosions blooming in the sky, none touching the killers diving from the sun. The Japanese warplanes knew this. They came in low, in pairs, in waves, each pilot certain that American fire was little more than noise. Even the kamikaze understood. The guns would roar, but rarely bite. Against that kind of confidence, steel decks became altars, and ships became offerings. Something had to change, not in strategy, not in bravery, but in the laws of physics themselves. America needed a weapon that could see without eyes, react without orders, and kill without touching. A weapon made not of steel, but of mathematics. And so, in a sealed laboratory beneath layers of secrecy, engineers began forging the impossible, a shell that would know when a plane was near. Churchill would call it a miracle. History would call it inevitable. We know it by its cold, true name, the proximity fuse. The story of the proximity fuse does not begin with triumph. It begins with a failure so vast, so suffocating, that the U.S. Navy nearly bled out beneath it. For 2 long years, American anti-aircraft guns fought the Pacific War with ammunition that behaved like blind metal, deaf to altitude, indifferent to speed, faithful only to guesswork. The problem was not skill. American gunners trained relentlessly. Some could reload in the dark, guided only by muscle memory. But no amount of training could overcome the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare. A shell that detonated even 10 meters too early might as well have exploded on the moon. Their guns relied on mechanical sights, beautiful in design, elegant in theory, utterly useless in practice. By the time a gunner cranked the final dial, the target had already changed altitude or speed or direction. The ocean sky was too wide, the Japanese pilots too skilled, and the weapons simply too slow. Worse still were the timed fuses, tiny mechanical clocks buried inside the shell. They required predictions, and in war, prediction is the first thing to die. A pilot banking slightly left or right could invalidate an entire barrage of fire. And so the statistics grew horrifying. Gunners joked grimly that they were firing mathematical prayers. Roughly 1,000 shells produced 1 kill. For the sailors on deck, this meant that survival depended not on skill or doctrine, but on a miracle, one that never came. Then the kamikaze arrived. They did not dogfight or evade. They surrendered their lives to gravity and flame. A single one slipping through could turn steel decks into molten ruin, drag men into the inferno, and leave survivors standing in dazed silence on a ship that no longer resembled a ship. The Navy reported ship after ship damaged or lost, not because American crews were incompetent, but because their weapons belonged to an older century. Battleships designed for duels at sea were now preyed upon by small aircraft worth a fraction of their cost. It was in this desperation that the call went out, not for soldiers, but for minds. MIT mathematicians, Naval Research Laboratory physicists, obscure radio engineers from forgotten workshops, all were summoned. They traveled under cover of secrecy, carrying notebooks filled with equations that looked more like spells than science. Their meeting rooms were dim, curtains drawn tight, lamps flickering like candles in a bunker. Chalkboards filled with jagged lines of oscillations. Models of shells with their noses removed lay open on tables like metallic cadavers. The order they received was impossible, almost sacrilegious in its ambition. Build a fuse that could calculate distance faster than a human mind. Build it small enough to fit in a shell. Build it strong enough to survive being fired from a naval gun. Build it soon enough to save the Pacific Fleet. In that pressure, mathematical, spiritual, historical, the birth of a miracle became inevitable. The old weapons had failed, and now something new had to rise from the wreckage, a shell that could feel, could sense, could know. In every war, there are weapons that announce themselves with splendor, massive guns, roaring engines, steel beasts. And then there are the quiet ones, the uncelebrated miracles that look indistinguishable from scrap metal. The proximity fuse belonged to the second category. It had no dramatic silhouette, no gleaming body, nothing that suggested divinity or dread. But inside it, hidden beneath layers of metal and powder, was an idea so radical that even seasoned officers whispered about it like a superstition. A shell that could sense. A shell that could know. The principle, on paper, was absurdly elegant. Place a miniature radio transmitter inside the nose of the shell, let it broadcast a constant signal, and then teach the shell to listen to its own echo. If a Japanese plane flew near it, the returning waves would interfere with the outgoing ones. The pattern, those microscopic ripples, would shift, and when the shift grew too violent, when the radio's heartbeat fluttered in a very specific rhythm, the fuse would awaken. It would declare the moment of death. It would detonate. The engineers described it in technical memos using the cold language of physics: amplitude modulation, phase shift, threshold resonance. But when they spoke privately, over burnt coffee and ashtray-filled tables, their tones softened. They admitted it felt like crafting a creature, a mechanical spirit. The shell was not calculating distance in the human sense. It was recognizing presence. It was responding to nearness the way a living organism might respond to heat or scent. In a world of metal and mathematics, the proximity fuse was the closest thing to intuition ever forged in steel. Yet turning that mystical idea into something that could survive the violence of battle was almost impossible. A shell is not gently placed into the air. It is launched from a 5-inch gun with a brutal, bone-crushing acceleration. Tens of thousands of Gs slam into every component inside. Glass tubes shatter, coils deform, antennas snap. In the first months of testing, nearly every prototype died instantly. Some detonated prematurely, others fizzled out without a spark. Engineers joked, nervously, that the proximity fuse had the soul of a monk, but the body of a sick Lauren. It could think, but not survive. The breakthrough required a kind of stubbornness bordering on obsession. They redesigned the vacuum tubes with reinforced glass, then with shock mounts. They invented tiny metal cages to cradle fragile components. They tested spring mechanisms that could absorb the G-force, like lungs absorbing air. Every failure taught them something: how radio waves behaved when battered, how circuits screamed under strain, how to shield delicate electronics from the fury of ignition. Slowly, impossibly, the creature inside the shell began to grow bones. The decisive test came on a wind-swept afternoon off the Chesapeake. A drone airplane, nothing more than a wooden target with an engine, buzzed overhead. A gun crew loaded a proximity fuse shell. No one spoke. Even the sea seemed to still itself. The shot roared. The shell arced into the sky. For a moment, nothing. Then, abruptly, violently, light bloomed beside the drone. Not a direct hit. A knowing hit. The drone tore apart midair, as if some invisible hand had pinched its wings. Smoke spiraled down like a signature. One officer whispered, almost reverently, "It's alive." In that moment, the Pacific War tilted. No longer would American ships rely on luck, timing, or miracles. They had created a miracle of their own. A shell with a pulse, a weapon with a sense of nearness, a machine that could decide its own moment of death for the sake of taking an enemy with it. And as the engineers watched the drone wreckage fall into the sea, they understood something chilling and profound. They had not just built a better fuse. They had given instinct to steel. Okinawa, spring 1945. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a ritual chamber stretched above a dying ocean. Waves carrying pieces of burned steel washed against the hulls of American ships as kamikaze squadrons appeared on the horizon like a procession of doomed spirits. Every sailor understood the truth. If the swarm broke through, the fleet would not survive the day. The Japanese pilots descended not as mere combatants, but as living sacrifices, determined to turn their deaths into fire. The first sound of the battle was not the alarm klaxon, it was the trembling percussion of the 5-inch guns firing into the gray morning. Shell casings clanged across the deck, steam hissed from scorched metal, and the sea vibrated under the thunder of American fire. Yet above all of it, another sound pulsed, quiet, faint, almost impossible to hear, a soft electrical heartbeat, the heartbeat of the proximity fuses. Inside each shell, a miniature radio transmitter awoke the moment it left the barrel. It sent out invisible waves, measurements, questions, tiny echoes of intent. When those waves struck the curved metal skin of a Japanese aircraft, they bounced back with a shift, a tremor, a subtle twist in frequency. The shell listened. It interpreted. It judged distance in a fraction of a heartbeat. And as each kamikaze descended, its engine howling, its wings trembling under compressed air, the returning signal grew stronger. The oscillation rose like a chant in a dark temple. The fuse sensed the threshold approaching, the mathematically ordained moment of destruction. To the sailors watching from the decks below, it looked as if the shells themselves had opened their eyes. Then came the first breakthrough. A kamikaze dove toward the battleship line, slicing through the smoke like a blade forged from desperation. The American gunners tracked it, too fast, too steep, too late. But the proximity rounds had already begun their silent ritual. 3 shells passed within meters of the incoming aircraft. They did not hit it. They did not need to. In midair, the fuses tasted the perfect frequency, a violent spike in the returning wave that signaled proximity. A moment later, 3 blinding spheres blossomed around the aircraft, not as impacts, but as detonations born from mathematical certainty. The shock waves hit the kamikaze like the hands of an unseen god. Its wings tore apart, its fuselage twisted open, fire spilled from its veins. The Zero spiraled downward, leaving a ribbon of smoke that trailed like a torn banner. It struck the sea with the finality of a ritual completed, swift, decisive, almost ceremonial. For the first time during the campaign, the deck crews felt the impossible. Relief. The sky had answered. But the battle only intensified. Dozens more kamikazes approached, each pilot gripping the control stick with the resolve of a man already dead. Ships disappeared behind curtains of smoke as anti-aircraft batteries filled the heavens with steel. Through the chaos, proximity fuses performed the same cold, immaculate calculation again and again. They detonated where no human eye could track, at distances that no timed fuse could anticipate. A sailor later wrote, "I never saw the weapon. I only saw the sky crack open." His words captured the paradox of the technology. The most devastating force on the battlefield was also the least visible. To the men on deck, it felt as though the heavens themselves had chosen sides. Wave after wave of kamikazes fell short of the fleet, torn apart before they could manifest their suicidal purpose. Battleships that should have been engulfed in flame survived with barely a scar. Destroyers that once relied on luck now relied on mathematics wrapped in steel. Proximity fuses had turned the air surrounding the fleet into a killing field, a sacred perimeter defined by radio waves. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, American gunners no longer spoke of hoping to hit incoming aircraft. They spoke of certainty. They spoke of patterns, thresholds, and zones of death that no pilot could cross. The invisible weapon, dismissed by some as impractical, impossible, or too fragile for war, had rewritten the fate of the Pacific. And as the ocean swallowed the wreckage of yet another kamikaze, the sailors finally understood what the engineers had built: a weapon without glory, a miracle without a name, a machine that sensed death more precisely than any human ever could. The battle over Okinawa ended not with a roar, but with a strange, exhausted quiet, a silence so heavy it felt like a second kind of storm. Ships drifted across the scarred water, their decks littered with shrapnel and scorch marks, but still afloat. For many sailors, survival felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare whose echoes still clung to their clothes. They did not yet understand why they were alive. All they knew was that the sky, once filled with screaming steel, had finally stopped trying to kill them. The officers' reports were clinical: improved anti-air capability, higher interception rate, increased defensive efficiency. But none of those sterile phrases captured the truth. Something invisible had fought beside them. Something that did not wear a uniform, did not shout orders, did not bleed. A weapon hidden inside a shell casing, small enough to fit in a hand, powerful enough to tilt the Pacific War. The proximity fuse did not gleam like a sword, nor roar like a cannon. It whispered, through oscillations and interference patterns, performing its lethal ritual in silence. It killed without being seen. It saved without being thanked. In the great machinery of war, it was a ghost, present everywhere, acknowledged nowhere. For years after the war, sailors told stories of miracle moments, times when an incoming kamikaze simply broke apart mid-air as if touched by the hand of some unseen guardian. They often credited their gunners, their ship's luck, or divine intervention. None suspected that dozens of microscopic components, resistors, condensers, vacuum tubes, had made the decision for them in fractions of a millisecond. The true savior was circuitry no bigger than a child's toy. And yet the engineers who birthed this ghost weapon walked through victory unnoticed. Many of them returned to quiet jobs, teaching, building radios, repairing circuits in small towns. They had created one of the most consequential technologies of the 20th century, yet they carried the secret like a shadow. Even their families often never knew. They were craftsmen of destruction whose names never entered the textbooks. The U.S. military kept the proximity fuse classified long after the war. Official histories glossed over it. Sailors spoke around it without understanding. It was too valuable, too strange, too ahead of its time. A weapon based on pure mathematics, on waveforms and probabilities, felt more like sorcery than engineering. Perhaps that is why the world did not know what to do with it. Heroes in metal helmets are easy to celebrate. Heroes in lab coats are not. Winston Churchill, hearing only fragments of the classified reports, wrote a single haunting line: "The proximity fuse was the greatest scientific gift to the war effort, second only to the atomic bomb." Coming from a man who witnessed the birth of radar, code-breaking, and jet engines, this was no small praise. It was a confession. that invisible power had reshaped the fate of nations. What made it so powerful was not the explosion itself, but the idea that mathematics could hunt, that formulas could kill, that numbers could predict the exact heartbeat before metal met metal in the sky. It was a weapon where logic replaced luck, and calculus replaced courage, a tool shaped not by fire, but by intellect, and its edge was sharper than steel. In the aftermath of the Pacific War, the world rebuilt its cities but ignored the invisible architectures that had saved them. Radar advanced, rockets evolved, missiles learned to think, and quietly beneath all these technologies, the DNA of the proximity fuse lived on. Its mathematical pulse echoing inside every guidance system, every sensor, every machine that could see without eyes. That is its final legacy. Not the ships it saved or the aircraft it destroyed, but the truth it carved into the foundations of war, that the future would belong to the unseen, to frequencies, to algorithms, to silent calculations shaping the world in microseconds. The proximity fuse did not end with a battlefield. It became a prophecy. Even today, if you stand on the deck of a modern destroyer surrounded by the cold architecture of radar domes and missile tubes, you're standing in the shadow of the proximity fuse. Its spirit is everywhere, in the hum of sensors, the blink of tracking lights, the silent arithmetic unfolding inside microchips. The sailor who survived Okinawa might not recognize the technology, but he would recognize the feeling, the presence of an unseen guardian. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a miracle, not that it is seen, but that it leaves survivors behind. The engineers who forged this ghost weapon never sought glory. They only wanted to solve a problem. But in doing so, they altered the architecture of war and saved lives they would never meet. Theirs was a victory made of silence. And yet the world still echoes with it. In the archives of the Naval Research Laboratory, buried under layers of dust and forgotten memos, sits a thin folder labeled simply VT 1943 to 1945. Inside is not a weapon nor a blueprint, but a ledger of names. Engineers, mathematicians, physicists, most of whom never appeared in any wartime documentary. Their work lived in darkness, and their triumph was carried forward by metal shells that never bore their signatures. Yet it is from this quiet ledger that our story truly ends. Looking at those names, one truth rises from the page. War is not shaped only by the men who pull triggers, but also by those who dare to imagine what has never existed. The proximity fuse was born not from brute force, but from intellect sharp enough to turn mathematics into a predatory instinct. It teaches us that the decisive edge in conflict often comes from the unseen. The calculations, the theories, the thinking hidden beneath the surface of steel. And in this quiet revelation lies the second lesson. The invisible is often stronger than the visible. The sailors who survived Okinawa never saw the circuitry that saved them. They only felt the absence of death. In a world obsessed with spectacle, bigger guns, louder explosions, the proximity fuse whispered a different doctrine, that the future belongs to frequency, not fire, to precision, not power. And finally, as we close the folder and return it to the silence of the archives, we confront the last lesson. Not all heroes have names. Some reshape history with chalk on a blackboard, not rifles on a battlefield.
Some save lives they will never meet in places they will never see. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon. It was a reminder that humanity's greatest victories often come from minds working quietly in the shadows. So if this story resonates with you, if the hidden architecture of war, the forgotten miracles of engineering, the silent guardians of history call to you, then leave a sign. A like, a subscribe, or a comment is enough to tell me which forgotten legend you want unearthed next. For in the greatest battles of mankind, sometimes the force that decides everything is just a single pulse of frequency.